Welcome back to the Deep Dive, the place where we sift through the most complex regulatory stacks to give you the clear, actionable insights you need.
Great to be here.
Today, we are undertaking, well, a really crucial deep dive. It's into a topic that's quietly changed the fortunes of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands, of international entrepreneurs. We're talking about the surprising and frankly often impossible compliance gauntlet facing foreign-owned single-member LLCs, SMLLCs, when they try to enter the U.S. market.
That's absolutely right. And our sources today, they really paint a picture of a dramatic shift. For years, the U.S. pitch was so simple.
Right. Come on in. The water's fine.
Exactly. Form a company quickly, maybe Delaware, maybe Wyoming, somewhere easy, and boom, you've got your U.S. entity. Simple.
But that promise, that simple promise, it now runs headlong into a reality that's, well, it's defined by document demands, really stringent identity checks, and regulatory hurdles that you just can't negotiate around.
Non-negotiable is the key word.
So the mission today is really to cut through some of that marketing noise you still see out there. Because while forming the LLC itself, that initial step, it's still easy. Often low cost, you can do it online.
Sure, the state filing is quick.
But the next step, the process of making that company actually functional, meaning able to transact business, crucially, open a bank account, and meet federal tax obligations, that path is now blocked by these systemic barriers.
And that contrast between easy formation and impossible function creates this massive problem for the foreign entrepreneur. Think about it. A company that can't receive money, can't pay bills.
It's not really a company, is it? It's just paper.
It's just a piece of paper. And the fundamental insight when you pull together all the recent policy changes, the regulations, the bank practices is this. The era of operating a functional U.S. business using only, say, a virtual mailing address or just your registered agent's address, that's definitively over.
I kind of think of it as a compliance paradox. The state government, maybe Wyoming, happily takes your $100 formation fee. They hand you the keys to this legal structure. But then right behind that open door the state provided, the federal banking system has basically installed a solid steel wall.
That's a good way to put it. A steel wall built brick by brick through regulation.
Let's unpack how that wall got built. We need to start with what we're calling the regulatory death of the virtual address. Where did this difficulty really begin?
Well, like you said earlier, it wasn't overnight. It wasn't some arbitrary bureaucratic whim. It stems directly from really more than a decade of intensifying regulatory pressure. Primarily driven by anti-money laundering, AML, and counterterrorist financing efforts. These became hugely aggressive, as you'd expect, following 9/11.
Okay.
And that pressure, it eventually forced financial institutions, the banks, to shift their approach. They had to move from just, checking boxes on a form to demanding verifiable physical substance for the businesses they banked.
Right, so we need to trace that evolution, because it wasn't just one rule change, was it? There were phases. Let's start with phase one, the sort of initial strike. That was the Customer Identification Program, the CIP rule, way back in 2003.
Yes, exactly. The CIP rule came directly out of Section 326 of the USA Patriot Act of 2001. The rule itself, if you want the detail, it's in the Code of Federal Regulations, 31 CFR Section 0020.220.
And what did it mandate? What did banks suddenly have to do?
It made it mandatory for banks to establish, document, and crucially, verify the identity of any customer opening an account. Now, for a business customer, a key part of that verification was obtaining the business's principal place of business or its local office or, quote, other physical location.
Some kind of physical location.
Yes, the goal was simple on paper. Prove you are actually located somewhere real.
Okay, that sounds reasonable enough on the surface. But you mentioned a loophole earlier. The initial interpretation, or maybe the application, by the banks. That's where things went a bit sideways.
Precisely. For years, many financial institutions, and you can understand why, they preferred ease of business. They wanted to process new customers quickly. They often accepted the address of the LLC's registered agent as satisfying that physical location requirement.
Even though the registered agent is often just a company providing a statutory address service.
Correct. The thinking, or maybe the rationalization, was something like, well, this is the legal address where the company receives important legal documents, service of process, so we'll count that. It's an address.
And that was the key that unlocked the whole virtual company phenomenon for non-residents, wasn't it?
Absolutely. That's the genesis of the virtual shell company, or at least the ease of setting one up that could actually transact. You could form an LLC in Wyoming, list a professional registered agent's address in Cheyenne, maybe use a mail forwarder, and potentially open a U.S. account without ever setting foot in the country.
Just operate entirely remotely.
Exactly. And that reliance on the registered agent address, it fueled a massive industry. Mail forwarding, virtual offices. It facilitated the creation of literally hundreds of thousands of non-resident owned LLCs that might have had zero actual operational substance in the U.S.
But from the government's perspective, particularly the financial crime folks, that looks like a problem.
A huge problem. FinCEN, that's the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, part of the Treasury Department, they viewed this system, this ease of using just a registered agent address, as a really high-risk vector for illicit financial flows, money laundering, terrorist financing, sanctions evasion, all of it.
Okay, so CIP mandated an address, but banks were accepting the registered agent address. When did FinCEN decide that wasn't good enough? When did they force the banks to actually close that loophole? That brings us to phase 2, right? The shift to demanding verifiable substance.
Phase 2 really hit hard with the FinCEN Customer Due Diligence Final Rule. We often call it the CDD Rule. It was finalized earlier, but it fully went into effect in May 2018. This truly was the game changer.
Okay, the CDD Rule, 2018. What did it do that was so different? How did it raise the bar so drastically?
It did a couple of key things. First, it focused intensely on identifying and verifying the beneficial owners, so the actual human beings, the natural persons who ultimately own or control 25% or more of the company or have significant managerial control.
Right, looking behind the corporate structure.
Exactly, piercing that veil. But second, and crucially for our discussion today, it demanded that banks understand the nature and purpose of the customer relationship. And part of that understanding involved ensuring the customer, the business, was legitimate and not just a shell. It implicitly required banks to do more digging on that physical presence aspect.
So wait, help me understand the mechanics here. Why didn't they just tighten the screws on the old CIP rule? What was it about the CDD rule specifically that forced banks to change their behavior regarding the address?
That's a really critical distinction. Think of the CIP rule as a formal requirement. Check the box, get an address, document it. The CDD rule, however, shifted the focus dramatically towards substance and active risk mitigation by the bank.
Risk.
Yes. Banks are now, frankly, terrified of regulatory noncompliance under CDD. FinCEN has levied absolutely massive fines for failures in AML programs, failures to adequately identify beneficial owners, failures to monitor transactions, failures related to shell companies.
We're talking serious money, right? Not just a slap on the wrist.
Oh, absolutely. Fines against major global banks routinely run into the hundreds of millions, sometimes even billions of dollars. So the risk appetite for banking a high-risk, potentially paper-only shell company, especially one owned by a non-resident where visibility is lower, it just plummeted under the CDD regime. It wasn't worth the potential penalty.
So the banks reacted defensively. They didn't just meet the bare minimum of the CDD text. They implemented really stringent internal compliance policies to protect themselves. Policies that often go beyond what the rule explicitly states.
Precisely. Self-preservation. They needed ironclad proof, documented proof, that the business wasn't just a mail drop, wasn't a shell, to show the regulators if they came knocking. To meet their compliance mandate under CDD, and more importantly, to mitigate that massive financial risk, banks moved decisively past accepting the registered agent address.
And they started demanding proof of operational substance, real operations.
Yes. And this is where the paper trail gets really heavy and, as we said before, non-negotiable.
So what are we talking about? What are these specific document demands that banks now make? This is where the dream of the purely virtual U.S. business really hits the wall, isn't it?
It hits the wall and crumbles, usually at the utility company or the landlord's office. Banks now routinely, and often with zero flexibility, demand specific documents that uniquely link the LLC's actual operation to a specific verifiable physical location in the United States.
Like what? Give us the specifics.
The most common, the gold standard really, is a business utility bill. And they're usually quite specific about this. They want to see an electricity bill, maybe a water bill, sometimes a dedicated, verifiable business landline phone bill. Not a mobile phone, not usually a shared VoIP service number.
Something tied physically to the premises.
Exactly. Or, alternatively, if you don't have that utility bill in the LLC's name yet, they'll require a formal, executed lease agreement for physical office space, a real lease, showing the LLC as the tenant at that specific address.
Which means no more using just a virtual office address you share with 50 other companies.
Generally, no. Banks see right through that now.
No co-working space address unless maybe you have a dedicated lockable office and can somehow get a utility bill there.
That might be a gray area, but it's difficult. And definitely, absolutely no, just using the registered agent address listed on the state filing certificate. That's almost universally rejected now for account opening.
Why the utility bill? What makes that so compelling for the bank?
Think about it. A utility bill, especially an electricity or water bill, is incredibly hard to get issued in a company's name unless that company has actually established service at a physical location. It requires contracts, potentially deposits, actual usage. It's a strong indicator of physical presence and operation.
It's the bank's way of forming that reasonable belief. Isn't that a phrase from the regulations?
Yeah,
That the business is legitimate and operating from a real physical place.
precisely. That reasonable belief standard is key. And the easiest, most objective way for them to document that belief to satisfy regulators is with that utility bill or that formal lease agreement, specifically in the name of the LLC, matching the claimed principal place of business address.
So if you, the foreign entrepreneur, can't provide one of those documents,
The account opening process just stops dead in its tracks. Doesn't matter how nice your website is or how great your business plan sounds. No lease or utility bill in the LLC's name. No U.S. bank account. Period.
wow, it fundamentally redefines what constitutes a U.S. business in the eyes of the financial system, doesn't it? It's not just about the legal filing anymore.
Not at all. The hurdle has shifted entirely from the state capitol building, where you file the papers, to the compliance department of the nearest bank branch, or more likely, their central processing unit.
The state allows the formation, maybe collects a small fee, maybe boasts about being business-friendly.
Exactly. They generate revenue from formations. But the federal banking system, operating under the extreme pressure of potential FinCEN penalties, is the entity that actually dictates operational feasibility in the U.S. market.
And without that utility bill or lease, the LLC formation paperwork you paid for.
It's effectively rendered worthless for the purpose of actually conducting commerce in the U.S. It's a license to exist legally, but not a license to operate financially.
Okay, that is a huge wall, the banking operational wall built by CDD. But let's say somehow an entrepreneur manages that. Maybe they do rent a small office, they get that utility bill. They're not out of the woods yet, are they?
Not even close. They've cleared the banking hurdle for now, but they immediately run into a completely separate and arguably equally devastating hurdle before they can operate legally and meet their obligations.
Which is?
The tax ID wall. Let's move into Section 2, the identity verification hurdle. This is all about proving who you are, not just where your business is.
Okay, tax IDs.
Yeah.
So we're shifting focus now from the entity's substance, its physical location, to the owner's identity and the entity's tax identity.
That's right. Before any foreign-owned SMLLC can really operate, receive income legally, pay vendors, and, critically, file the required U.S. tax returns, they need two specific taxpayer identification numbers, or TINs.
Two TINs, okay.
Yes, and that this distinction is absolutely crucial because the process and the difficulty of obtaining each one are wildly different. You need the business's employer identification number, the EIN.
The EIN, right. That's for the business itself.
Correct. And you also need the owner's individual taxpayer identification number, the ITIN.
The ITN, for the individual foreign owner. Why are these two so different in terms of difficulty? Let's start with the EIN. You mentioned earlier it's relatively easy. Why is that?
Okay, so the EIN, it's the business's federal tax ID number. It's absolutely mandatory for filing certain required tax forms, like the Informational Return Form 5472 we'll discuss later. And as we just established, it's also a non-negotiable prerequisite for opening that U.S. bank account.
Got it. Essential piece. How does a non-resident owner get one if they don't have a U.S. Social Security number or an IPIN already?
Right, that's the key. If the responsible party listed on the application doesn't have their own USTIN, like an SSN or ITIN, they cannot apply for the EIN online through the IRS website. That fast, easy route is closed off.
So what's the alternative?
The alternative is submitting the application, which is Form SS4, Application for Employer Identification Number, to the IRS by international fax or by mail.
International fax, seriously. In 2024, 2025.
Believe it or not, yes. It sounds incredibly archaic, like something out of the 1990s. But international fax remains the standard recommended method for non-residents without a TIN to apply for an EIN. Mail is an option, but it's even slower.
Okay, so it's slow, but maybe not overly complicated in terms of documents.
That's the relatively easy part. While it is slow, you're often looking at a processing time that can stretch anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks, sometimes longer, depending on IRS backlogs.
Weeks without an EIN, which you need for the bank account. That's already a delay.
It is a delay, absolutely. But the document requirement itself is comparatively simple, which makes it, let's say, the path of least resistance compared to the ITN.
What do they actually need to send in with that Form SS4 besides the form itself?
Here's the key acceptance detail, the crucial difference. For the EIN application via Form SS4, the IRS generally accepts a legible copy of the foreign passport belonging to the designated responsible party.
Just a photocopy.
Yes, a clear, legible copy. You're sending a copy of the passport identification page, not the original document. And importantly, you typically don't need any kind of special certification like an apostille or a consular verification or anything like that for the passport copy submitted with the SS4.
Ah, okay. So the risk is low. You just fax or mail a copy.
Exactly. That flexibility, accepting a simple copy, is what fundamentally sets the EIN process apart from the ITN process and makes it achievable without incurring massive additional costs or the terrifying risk of mailing your original passport.
So once that EIN is finally issued, weeks later, the business has its tax ID. But the owner still needs theirs, right?
Correct. The business can now theoretically move forward with the bank account attempt, assuming they have the utility bill, but the owner's personal compliance hurdle remains.
And this is where the difficulty really ramps up significantly. Let's talk about the ITN, the owner's personal tax ID. Why does this single number cause so much more pain and difficulty than the EIN?
Okay, the ITN. It stands for Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. It's the personal tax ID for the foreign owner. It is absolutely mandatory for that owner to comply with their individual U.S. tax filing requirements. Specifically, if they have U.S. tax obligations, they'll likely need to file Form 1040-NR, the non-resident alien income tax return.
And the application for the ITN is Form WD-7.
Correct. Form W-7, Application for IRS Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. And this form, this process, is where that identity verification wall becomes almost vertical and incredibly unforgiving.
What is the core issue? What's the primary hurdle that makes this so much harder than sending a passport copy for the EIN?
The primary hurdle is what I call the original document requirement wall. To process that Form W-7 application, the IRS requires the applicant to submit original identification documents for almost all foreign applicants. This means their current, valid foreign passport or a specifically certified copy of that passport.
Okay, wait. Submitting your original passport, the single most important document you own, the one that proves your citizenship, allows you to travel. Mailing that internationally to a massive government agency like the IRS, that sounds terrifying.
It is terrifying. And it's an incredible risk, bordering on prohibitive for many people. Mailing that original passport across borders subjects the document to all the risk of international mail getting lost, damaged, stolen.
And delays.
And potentially substantial delays. The processing time for an ITN application submitted with an original passport can easily stretch 3 to 6 months, sometimes even longer, especially during peak tax season or if there are IRS backlogs.
6 months without your passport.
Yes. And during that entire period, the owner is effectively grounded. They can't travel internationally. They likely can't apply for visas for other countries. They can't easily prove their identity for major transactions in their own country. It's a massive personal and professional disruption.
So clearly, mailing the original is a last resort, if even an option for most. That leaves the certified copy route. But this isn't just any certification, is it? This is the catch.
This is the critical catch, the aha moment that trips up so many applicants and inexperienced advisors. If you, as a foreign entrepreneur, go down to your local notary public in your home country, or even if you find a U.S. notary public and they notarize a photocopy of your passport.
That's not good enough for the IRS, for the W-7.
Absolutely. Unequivocally not good enough. A standard notary public, whether foreign or U.S.-based, typically just certifies that the person signing a document appeared before them and showed identification. They are not certifying that the copy of the identification document itself is a true, correct, and unaltered reproduction of the original document.
The IRS needs that higher level of assurance.
Far higher. They're dealing with tax identification, potential fraud, identity theft. They need very strong assurance that the passport copy they receive is legitimate. Therefore, standard notarization, especially from a U.S. notary public who isn't specifically authorized for this purpose, is completely rejected by the IRS for ITIN applications. It's a common point of failure.
Okay, so if a regular notary isn't sufficient, where must this special certification come from? You mentioned 2 authorized sources.
Correct. There are essentially only 2 ways to get a passport copy certified that the IRS will accept for a Form W-7 application besides sending the original. Both introduce their own significant administrative or financial burdens.
What's option 1?
Option 1 is to obtain a certified copy directly from the passport issuing agency itself. So the government agency in your home country that issued your passport.
How feasible is that?
It varies wildly by country, but it's often incredibly complicated, potentially very time-consuming, and might be geographically restrictive. You might need to apply in person at a specific government office, fill out lengthy applications, pay fees, wait weeks or months.
And potentially deal with things like apostilles.
Yes, depending on the country and U.S. requirements, an apostille, which is a specific type of international certification verifying the authenticity of a public document, might be needed as well. So while this option does satisfy the IRS, it can be extremely administratively burdensome, sometimes practically impossible for someone living far from the necessary government offices.
Okay, that sounds tough. What's option 2? You mentioned it's safer regarding the passport, more practical maybe, but introduces a significant cost factor.
Option 2, and this is the route most informed applicants prefer if they can manage it, is to utilize an IRS-authorized Certified Acceptance Agent, or CAA.
Certified Acceptance Agent. Okay, what are they?
CAAs are specific individuals. They're often accountants, CPAs, enrolled agents, attorneys, or other tax professionals who have gone through a rigorous application process with the IRS. This includes extensive background checks and specialized training. The IRS then authorizes them specifically to assist non-resident aliens and other foreign persons in obtaining ITINs.
And crucially, they can verify the passport.
Yes, that's their key function in this context. They are authorized by the IRS to review and verify the applicant's original identification documents, primarily the passport, in person, or sometimes via secure video link if they have specific authorization for remote verification, though in person is more common.
Walk us through that CAA process. How does it work, and why does it add that substantial cost you mentioned?
Okay, so the entrepreneur typically needs to find a CAA. The IRS has a directory online, though finding one convenient geographically can sometimes be a challenge. They schedule an appointment. During the meeting, the CAA will physically examine the original passport, comparing it to the applicant.
So the passport never leaves the owner's sight.
Correct. The CAA examines the original, verifies its authenticity, and confirms the applicant's identity. Once satisfied, the CAA fills out a certificate of accuracy, attaches a copy of the passport that the CAA themselves certifies as true, and submits the complete W-7 package, including the certificate of accuracy and the certified passport copy, directly to a special processing unit at the IRS.
That sounds much safer. The passport stays with the owner, mitigating that huge travel and loss risk. But the cost?
The cost comes because you're engaging a highly specialized professional for a specific federally mandated compliance service. This isn't like getting a document notarized for $5 or $10.
Right.
CAAs are providing a valuable service that requires expertise, involves liability, and facilitates compliance with complex IRS rules designed to prevent fraud. So you're paying for their time, their expertise, and their authorization. The service can easily add hundreds, sometimes even thousands of dollars to the initial business setup costs, depending on the CAA's fees and location.
So what might have been marketed as, say, a $500 LLC formation package suddenly balloons into a multi-thousand-dollar endeavor once you factor in the mandatory CAA fees just to get the owner's personal tax ID.
Precisely, and that becomes a significant, often unexpected barrier to entry, especially for smaller, self-funded entrepreneurs or freelancers just trying to access the U.S. market legitimately.
That distinction is huge. A simple copy is okay for the business EIN, though slow, but you need the original or a costly CAA certified copy for the owner's ITN. That difference is a massive point of failure, isn't it?
It's arguably the ultimate choke point in the entire process for many foreign founders. You might successfully navigate the LLC formation, maybe even struggle through getting the EIN via fax after WINCs, but then you hit the ITIN wall.
And until the owner gets that ITN.
Until that owner successfully navigates the complex and potentially expensive CAA route or takes the risk with the passport issuing agency, they are personally non-compliant with U.S. tax law from day one, assuming they have a filing requirement. This compromises the entire structure before it even earns a single penny.
Right. So let's try to synthesize these two massive walls now in our final section. We've got the banking wall, the CDD rule demanding physical proof like a utility bill, and we've got the tax ID wall, the ITIN hurdle, demanding expensive, specialized identity verification for the owner. When you put those together, what's the result? You called it the useless company dilemma.
Exactly. The useless company dilemma and the compliance bottleneck. It's the core of the paradox we started with. You can easily buy the LLC structure at the state level. It's legally incorporated. But the journey from that piece of paper to a genuinely functional, operating, compliant company is incredibly arduous, and for many, practically impossible under the current rules if they planned on being purely virtual.
And this creates a bottleneck where the business simply cannot function legally or meet its mandatory federal obligations.
Correct. It gets stuck.
Let's quickly reiterate why that bank account is so critical, the operational necessity, and how getting it ties back to both the hurdles we've discussed.
Sure. The U.S. bank account is absolutely the engine of the business. It's essential for, let's say, 3 critical functions. First, just practical day-to-day operations.
Making money, spending money.
Right. Processing customer payments, especially using major U.S. payment gateways like Stripe or PayPal, which almost always require a U.S. bank account. Paying suppliers, managing expenses, basic business functions.
Okay.
Second, legal maintenance of the entity itself. You must maintain the LLC's liability protection, the so-called corporate veil. That's usually the whole point of forming the LLC.
And using a personal account messes that up.
Completely. If a foreign owner starts using their personal foreign bank account for U.S. business transactions because they can't get a U.S. business account, they are commingling funds. That's a cardinal sin in corporate law. It pierces the veil, potentially exposing the owner's personal assets to business debts and lawsuits. It defeats the purpose of the LLC.
Okay, practicality, legal protection. And third, the regulatory necessity.
Third is simply the regulatory requirement we already covered. The bank account application process itself acts as the gatekeeper. The bank will demand the business's EIN as proof of its tax registration. And crucially, driven by the CDD rule, they will demand that proof of physical business substance, the lease, or the utility bill.
So the bank checks both boxes. Is the entity real and physically present? Utility billies check.
Yeah.
And is it registered with the IRS? EIN check.
Exactly. If the bank is unwilling or unable, due to its compliance policies, to open that account because you failed either check, the entire U.S. operation grinds to a halt. Doesn't matter if you have customers lined up or products ready to ship, no bank account, no U.S. business, effectively.
Okay, now let's shift to the tax compliance side. What are the specific severe consequences if the owner cannot get their ITN, which blocks the final step of actually filing the required tax returns?
This is where non-compliance gets really, really expensive, really fast. U.S. tax law is crystal clear on this. Internal Revenue Code Section 6109 explicitly states that a taxpayer identification number, whether an SSN, EIN, or ITN, is non-negotiably required on all U.S. tax returns, statements, schedules, and other related documents filed with the IRS.
No TIN, no filing.
No TIN means you literally cannot comply with the filing requirements. It's impossible.
Okay, so detail those filing requirements. What does the LLC entity itself have to file, even if it's just a single-member LLC owned by a foreigner?
Right. By default, a foreign-owned SM LLC is treated as a disregarded entity for most U.S. income tax purposes, meaning its income and expenses would normally just flow through to the owner. However, because of its foreign ownership, it has a specific critical informational filing requirement.
Informational, meaning it doesn't necessarily owe tax itself on this form.
Correct. It's primarily about disclosure. The LLC must file Form 5472, information return of a 25% foreign-owned U.S. corporation or a foreign corporation engaged in a U.S. trade or business. This form is filed along with the pro forma Form 1120, the corporate tax return form, even though the LLC isn't taxed as a corporation by default.
And what does Form 5472 report?
It discloses certain reportable transactions between the U.S. disregarded entity, the LLC, and its foreign owner or other foreign-related parties, things like contributions, distributions, payments for services, loans, etc. It's designed to give the IRS visibility into potential profit shifting or other cross-border issues.
And this filing is mandatory? What does it require?
Absolutely mandatory if there are reportable transactions. And crucially, filing Form 5472, attached to the Form 1120, requires the business's EIN. You cannot file it without the EIN.
What happens if the LLC fails to get the EIN in time or just doesn't realize it needs to file Form 5472 or can't file it for some reason?
The consequences are draconian. Failure to timely file a substantially complete Form 5472 carries a massive statutory penalty. The minimum penalty, let me stress that, minimum is $25,000.
$25,000 for missing an informational form.
$25,000 per form, per year. That is not the maximum penalty, it is the floor. And it gets worse. If the failure to file continues after the IRS notifies the business about the delinquency.
Which they will eventually.
Which they likely will, yes. An additional $25,000 penalty is assessed for each 30-day period or part thereof that the failure continues, up to a potentially unlimited amount theoretically, although there are caps in some related contexts. But the initial hit is $25,000 minimum.
Wow. Okay, so just failing to get the EIN sorted out quickly enough via that slow fax process, or not understanding this very specific filing requirement for foreign-owned disregarded entities, puts the business immediately in line for a devastating penalty.
Immediately. It creates severe financial jeopardy right out of the gate. This is why getting that EIN, despite the delays, is absolutely critical simply to avoid this catastrophic penalty.
Okay, so that's the entity's compliance nightmare tied to the EIN. Now, what about the owner's personal tax compliance? The part that relies on getting that difficult ITIN.
Right, that's the final piece of the compliance checkmate. The individual foreign earner, if they have a U.S. tax liability, for instance, from income effectively connected with a U.S. trade or business conducted through the LLC, or other U.S. filing requirements related to their ownership, must file a personal U.S. non-resident tax return. Typically, that's Form 1040-NR.
And Form 1040-NR requires?
It absolutely requires the owner's personal taxpayer identification number. Since they're foreign, that means they're ITN. You cannot file Form 1040-NR without an ITN or an SSN, which they wouldn't have.
So if the owner has failed to navigate that complex, potentially expensive ITIN certification process, maybe they couldn't find a CAA, couldn't afford one, or weren't willing to mail their passport,
then they simply cannot file their required U.S. personal tax return. They are automatically non-compliant with U.S. tax law. This can lead to penalties, interest accrual on unpaid taxes, and potentially bigger problems down the line if they ever want to engage further with the U.S. system, like applying for a visa or a green card.
So the ultimate result of hitting these walls is?
The ultimate result is you have this legally formed LLC, maybe registered in Delaware or Wyoming, looks perfect on paper, but it's entirely non-functional and non-compliant.
It can't transact business effectively because it likely can't open a U.S. bank account due to the CDD physical presence rules,
Right.
The utility bill lease requirement.
Correct.
The business itself faces a potential $25,000 minimum penalty because it needs an EIN, which takes time, to file Form 5472.
Also correct.
And the owner is personally in direct violation of U.S. tax law because they likely can't get the required IT easily or affordably enough to file their own Form 1040-NR.
That's the trifecta. The states might offer the lure of easy incorporation, but the federal regulatory environment, both banking and tax, ensures that the purely virtual, paper-only operating model for a foreign-owned LLC is effectively a non-starter if you want to be functional and compliant.
That level of detail really drives the reality home. It's not just a vague, oh, it's hard to open a bank account now. It's very specific. It's nearly impossible to open an account without a utility bill or lease in the LLC's name. And the separate, difficult ITIN process for the owner personally exposes the business to a potential minimum $25,000 fine right away if not handled correctly.
Precisely. And the key takeaway for anyone listening, especially foreign entrepreneurs considering a U.S. LLC, is that the real cost and the real risk are front-loaded in these compliance steps after formation.
You pay the small state fee, you get your certificate, you feel like you're in business.
Right, there's a sense of accomplishment. But the actual cost, the cost of compliance, potentially the cost of securing some kind of physical presence proof, the cost of the CAA for the ITIN, that is what ultimately determines success or failure in actually using the LLC, not the initial formation fee.
This has been, well, I think a necessary and really deep analytical look at what feels like a silent revolution in corporate compliance for foreigners targeting the U.S. market.
Oh.
Let's just briefly recap those critical roadblocks for our listener.
Absolutely. The compliance landscape now for a foreign-owned SMLLC wanting to operate functionally is defined by two distinct, pretty much non-negotiable walls. Wall number one, the banking wall.
Driven by the CDD Rule.
Driven entirely by the FinCEN 2018 CDD Rule and the resulting bank policies. This forces banks to demand unique, verifiable proof of physical operation, typically that utility bill or formal lease, effectively eliminating the viability of just using a registered agent or virtual office address for banking.
Okay, wall number two.
Wall number two, the tax ID wall, specifically the ITIN component. This is the significant identity verification hurdle required for the owner's personal ITIN, needed for their Form 1040 NR. The IRS's refusal to accept standard notarized passport copies means you must either risk mailing your original passport,
which is highly inadvisable,
or you incur the substantial cost and administrative complexity of securing certification from one of those IRS-authorized certified acceptance agents.
And understanding those specifics, the technical demands, like the difference between the passport copy needed for the EIN versus the certified original standard for the ITIN, and understanding the regulatory leverage that banks gain from the CDD framework forcing them to demand utility bills, that's really the only shortcut to grasping current U.S. corporate risk management policy in this area, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It fundamentally changes how you, as a potential founder or advisor, need to assess any advice or marketing you see about forming a U.S. entity as a non-resident. You have to filter everything through those two critical lenses.
Lens 1, can I realistically obtain and provide proof, like a utility bill or lease in my LLC's name, that my business is physically operational at a specific U.S. address? And lens 2, can I successfully navigate the ITIN application process, most likely via CAA, to secure my personal tax ID without losing my passport or breaking the bank?
If the answer to either of those is a shaky maybe or no, then the traditional foreign-owned SMLLC model might be the wrong path, or at least far more complex and expensive than anticipated. The barrier to entry has officially shifted.
From just a financial hurdle, paying the state filing fee, to a much more significant logistical, administrative, and compliance hurdle that demands verifiable operational substance and often specialized professional help.
Well put. It requires planning, resources, and a realistic understanding of these post-formation requirements.
And that logistical reality, that shift, leads us directly to our provocative final thought for you, the listener, to consider today. Given this absolute regulatory pressure being applied by FinCEN, channeled through the federal banking system, which now effectively demands tangible physical proof of operation via things like leases and utility bills, what does the future really hold for those U.S. states, think Delaware, Wyoming, Nevada, that continue to aggressively market easy formation, low costs, and promise corporate privacy to the world?
Yeah, where does that leave their sales pitch?
Exactly. If the federal gatekeepers of finance, the banks acting under regulatory duress, have effectively moved the goalposts so far as to demand substantive physical operations, hasn't that state promise of easy virtual access become, well, perhaps a little more than a profitable piece of potentially empty marketing?
That fundamental dissonance between the ease promised by state and corporation law and the harsh reality imposed by federal banking and tax enforcement, that's the great unanswered question looming over this entire area of international commerce. It's a tension that has to resolve somehow.
We'll leave you with that thought to mull over. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We genuinely hope this detailed exploration equips you to navigate this new, challenging compliance environment with a full awareness of the very high stakes involved.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power here. Until next time.